Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Student Ministry Conversations podcast with your hosts, Russell Martin and Brent Aiken. Hey, we're glad you're joining us today, and we hope that you find this conversation helpful, insightful, and encouraging as you continue to lead your students in ministry. We want to remind you, check us out on social media at Talk Student Men on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and studentministryconversations.org for our website. So today we're hearing a conversation with Brent and Jerry Varner, and they're going to talk about longevity in student ministry. So, Brent, can you tell me a little bit more about this conversation?
Yeah, so today the conversation for the podcast is with Jerry Varner. He is a veteran youth pastor, which has spent 26 years in youth ministry. He has been working at his current church for over a decade, and he is just a fantastic youth pastor, and we sit down to talk about longevity in youth ministry. Really, really great conversation. I don't want to spoil it, but this is one that you guys are going to love. Check it out.
Well, I'm looking forward to that as well. So without any further delay, here's Brent's conversation with Jerry Varner.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Student Ministry Conversations podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Brent Aiken. And today we are sitting down with Jerry Varner. And so Jerry is someone that we met over the Clubhouse app at the very beginning of this podcast. And Jerry does a lot of cool stuff, but instead of me kind of just dropping everything he does, I want to give him a chance to introduce himself. So Jerry, tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, where you work, how long you've been a youth pastor, and then anything else that you do.
Yeah. Hey, Brent. Clubhouse early adopters, right? Like, isn't that just such a youth pastor thing? Like some new shiny thing comes along and we dogpile that thing. And yeah, I was definitely one of those. So, but yeah, it was great to meet you guys on Clubhouse. So I've been in student ministry. I'm about 26 years now. And I started in 1995. That's when I graduated college, Nyack College in New York. And I graduated with a degree in Bible and youth ministry. And I was at my first church for 2 years, and I got all my mistakes out of the way. And then I went to my second church, and it was 7 years. I was there. I was actually back in Nyack, New York, and I served as a youth pastor there at a church, same town as my school was, and there was professors in the congregation and stuff. But so that was kind of weird to be in that town, but not be at school. So I was there for 7 years. Until 2004, and then God very clearly led me, for no bad reason, but led me from there to where I am now, just on the south side of Richmond, Virginia. And I've been here for 17 years, since 2004, serving as a student discipleship pastor. So married my college sweetheart, and we got married a month after graduation. About a year later, we found out that my wife was pregnant, and then we had 3 more after that. So I've got 4 kids, and my youngest, brace yourself, my youngest just turned 18 years old. So I've got a 24-year-old, a 21-year-old, a 19-year-old, and an 18-year-old. So and so I've been here for 17 years, and I love it. And I thought about this a lot. The only other thing that I think I would enjoy doing outside of like just formal student ministry, I think that I would enjoy designing miniature golf courses, because I just think there's a terrible lack of high quality miniature golf courses in our culture. And I think I would like to address that. So anyway, that's me in a nutshell.
Man, that is such a youth pastor job. I want to go design miniature golf courses because they're awful.
Not build them, just design them.
Just design them. I just want to come up with the sweet things.
Right.
No, that's awesome. But yeah, so obviously with you talking about your time in youth ministry and how long you've done it since 1995. First off, congrats. That's a huge, huge deal.
Thank you.
Because I am 31 and I was 5 when you started.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, Brent.
Yeah, you're welcome.
That helps.
So with that though, that is kind of the reason that we're here today. We're talking about longevity in youth ministry. And so I will say that I've been in youth ministry for a little while now. I'm pushing my 12th year. But man, like even the difference between 12 years and 26 years, there's a wealth of knowledge there. And so we really wanted to kind of sit down today and talk about that. And so why is longevity in youth ministry so important?
Well, I'll tell you what, I remember clearly when I started in youth ministry. Actually, before I even graduated college, I was in my student ministry college classes. Len Kegler was my professor then, still a very dear friend. And I remember just busting out these like soliloquies and these monologues probably to the classes, just chagrin and would this guy just please shut up? I remember just going on about, if God will let me breathe my last breath as a student ministry pastor, please let me do that. That's all I wanted to do. And I know there's different philosophies about and approaches to student ministry. I've talked with pastors that kind of look at as you got to pay your dues before you can kind of get your own church and be a lead pastor and things like that. But from the very beginning, I never ever felt that way. So from the time I graduated college, I just wanted to live and breathe as a youth pastor. That's all that I wanted. And so the reason why I feel like longevity is so important in student ministry. Number one, it's kind of like you probably maybe have heard this analogy before. It's kind of like a farmer. Like you're gonna put seed in the ground, and then you're just gonna have to wait. It's just gonna take a while before you see anything break the surface. And I found that just on the local church level, I found that you don't have any kind of like fruit, or you don't have any kind of traction until probably year 3 or 4. And so when we have this dynamic of this quick turnaround of youth pastors, and I'm glad that it's kind of grown over the years, I think. But that still most youth pastors are seeing an end to their local church ministry before they even have a chance to start to see those sprouts breaking the surface. And so the whole idea of longevity is one that's like super, I don't know, it's something that I get revved up about, and it's something that I'm really passionate about. And anytime, the older I get, I'm not ashamed to say, I just turned 48 last month, and the older I get, the more intense I feel this fire within me is like young past. Like I would consider you a very young youth pastor. Like I'm all about that group of people, because I feel like after 25 years, 26 years, I better have something to contribute to the younger generation of student ministry leaders. And I really feel, just a really strong passion about being able to take conversations just like this and to be able to say, I know that it's not 1995, and I know that it's not even 2000. I know we're in a very unique time in ministry, but the longer I've stayed in student ministry, the more principles I feel like I've kind of gathered as I've gone along. And when you are in I don't care if it's piano tuning or professional tennis or whatever it is, or plumbing, the longer you are in something, almost by default, the more in tune and sharper, hopefully in ministry, the better you're going to become. And so, that's a little bit. That was a little muddled, but that's a little bit why I feel like longevity is so important, because you really aren't going to see that fruit until several years in, at least.
Yeah, and I would totally agree with that. Just for the sake of, I'm at my current church now. I started in May of 2017, and so we're just now. We just finished the 4th year. We're now getting into year 5. And it's one of those things that we finally have the clarity of the students knowing what's going to happen. We have this clarity of the new students coming in with full expectation of what to expect. And this year alone, actually, in the past month and a half, I guess, we've had 3 students get baptized. And it's just one of those things that once that system of trust is there, once you know that the youth pastor is not going to be there, there's so much more buy-in to the vision and so much more buy-in to what is being said, what is being challenged. And it's just one of those things. We made that we made a challenge about, if you hadn't made the decision to follow Jesus, you need to, but if you haven't been baptized, man, like you need to do that as well. And from that challenge, we've had 3 kids step up. I mean, it's super, super cool to see. But I think longevity is a really big piece of that. And it's not necessarily that like us being in a youth ministry role for a long time has anything to do with like the salvation or the baptism process.
Right.
But like, it's that ease of mind. It's building that comfort level to where students trust us, students trust the environment and they're in. And when they start lowering their walls, when they start allowing those conversations to happen, life change happens. And that's not going to happen very often. I'm not going to say it never happens, but that doesn't happen very often in the first 2.5 years.
Right.
Because they got to learn that you're not going to leave them or abandon them like the last guy did. And all kinds of stuff like that. So kind of transitioning off of that question, and just to put you on the spot, you talked about how 26 years, you better have some advice for the younger youth pastor. Give me your maybe top 2 or 3 advice tips.
Okay. These are in no particular order. By the way, one of the things that I learned a long time ago that honestly, even to this day, I'm still trying my best to put into practice is to constantly ask yourself, what am I doing that someone else could be doing? So that and what am I doing that a student could be doing? Because I have never wanted to create a ministry that was like the Jerry song and dance hour, like come and watch me do my thing. So the more I can give away to students and just asking them, and I don't care how menial you think this task is or what it is. Now, obviously we don't want to, insult people by just giving them what I should say is just giving them the actual weight of ministry. So ask the question, what am I doing that somebody else could be doing? And better yet, what am I doing that another student could be doing? Another piece of advice I would give is constantly being on guard against how you're being replenished and how you're being fueled. We were talking maybe before we started recording about what is it that fuels us. We're recording here on a Friday, and this is our day off, but we get fuel from this. Like I get encouragement from talking to Brent, and hopefully there's going to be other people who are getting encouragement from this podcast episode. But what are you doing that's fueling you? Because my default setting is kind of the attitude of, no, I'll do that. I don't want to ask that person to do that because they have other things to do. So I'll do that. And so I was chief violator of that whole idea of guarding against burnout and guarding against, overworking. And I had good intentions about it, but I didn't do a very good job of being careful with my time and making sure that I've got time to just rest and replenish and refuel. So what is it that you're doing that on a regular basis that just fuels you, that gives you refreshment for your spirit, for your social life, for your mental life, for your emotions, and all of that stuff. Another thing that I would say is be careful what measuring stick you use. I can very easily fall into the trap of kind of feeling down when I don't see an expected number of kids walk in the door. And I start to just kind of have like this inner dialogue of like, oh man, I wish there were more students here, or I know that we normally have this amount of students and we're falling short of that. And so I would use this measuring stick of, well, this can't be good, or I guess I'm not doing my job, or God isn't blessing this ministry because I'm not seeing the numbers that in my imagination I think that we should have. And I'm not saying that numbers don't have a place. I'm just saying that I don't think they should be used as a primary metric of good things happening. I remember when I was in high school, there would be a fight, in the next hallway over, and people would just run to see it, because this is like free entertainment, so kids would just gather around, try and get in there before the teachers pulled them apart. And so I don't really think that a crowd necessarily indicates that something good is happening. Because a lot of times all you need is a spectacle and that will draw a crowd. So I don't think that like how big or small the crowd is a really good indicator of the good that God is doing or isn't doing. So I began to change my metric a long time ago from how many butts are in the seats to how many students are living the gospel wherever it is they are. I used to have, and by the way, I was listening to one of your previous episodes about youth sports, and there was a time when I would have hated that episode. Like I did not like what was being said because I'm an old guy and I can be a little bit old school, and I want like, hey, church should be a priority. Like our Wednesday night small groups, our Sunday morning worship gathering, that should be a priority. And if you don't show up, I don't know where you are with Jesus. So that used to be my mentality. And I was pretty critical against students who weren't faithful to show up, especially if they had, it's volleyball season or it's football season or, whatever. So I began to ask, not how often are they there? And I know that's important, but what is God doing in their lives through them and their testimony wherever they are? So is that kid looking at that soccer field as a place that God has placed them to be his hands and feet, to be his love and light to that soccer team or that show choir stage or that club after school, whatever it is? So those are a few things that kind of come to mind. If I was to just share some advice, things that I have gleaned over the years. And those are things that took me a while to learn. So if anybody can take any of that, especially if you're younger than I am in youth ministry, which is not hard to do, and apply that, then I think you're gonna find that that's pretty solid. That's pretty solid advice.
Man. All of those are absolute gems. And I totally agree. I too struggled with the whole sports concept for a long time. And it was just one of those things that was like, I think it finally clicked for me when one of those kids that is gone all the time came up and asked, how do I share Jesus with my teammate that is currently atheist or something like that? And it was just like a light bulb snapped, like, oh, they're still plugged in. They're still wanting to be here. They're still wanting to be involved. They still see Jesus as priority. Yeah. But like the mission field changed. They're no longer in youth, but they've taken that out into the world. And that's what we're training them to do. I mean, like, my word. And so like, in all seriousness, sometimes we are the biggest dampener to our own efforts. Right. Yeah. But geez. So with that being said, I'm sure there is tons of other Jerry Varner wisdom and advice, and we might have to like get you on the website doing like a blog post or something about a few of those as we get down the road. But I do want to kind of keep the topic at hand with what we are. I think all of those are great, and those are all signs of longevity in ministry. When you do something, like you said, for a long time, it doesn't matter if you're a plumber or anything, like you're going to learn tips and tricks of the trade that make your job better, make you more efficient as a doer of whatever job you have. And especially in youth ministry, when we can figure out through experience and wisdom of ways to cut through the fluff of youth ministry and get down to what really, really matters at the end of the day, it allows us to be more efficient. It allows us to be more effective. And the students buy in, I believe, even better, because a lot of the students don't even really want the fluff. A lot of the students are just very much like, we get that so much from the world around us. We want to be able to go sit down and like, we want to have like the hard truth kind of mindset of like, we want to focus, we want to pay attention, and we want to ask and challenge hard questions. Like, and man, my high school group, especially, I probably get 5-6 questions texted periodically throughout the week of stuff that sometimes I'm just like, I don't even know. I got to go research this, look this up. I'll be back and I'll get back to you. But I think that's important because they have that trust factor built, and that didn't come right when I got there. That took years to develop, which goes in with the conversation. And so I think we can also take this conversation and make it twofold. You have longevity in one church, but then you have longevity as a youth pastor just in the profession. And so why, kind of moving on to the next question at hand, why do you feel like student ministry, and you kind of chimed in on this a little bit earlier, but I wanted to see if you wanted to elaborate. Why do you feel like student ministry is treated like a job for the younger adults? You kind of talked about how the pastor, it's like a rite of passage.
Yeah. Well, I'll just be honest with you. As I've gotten older, especially in the second half of my fourth decade on Earth, I really have to be kind of honest about, and I don't mean to unspiritualize this whole thing, but as I get older, like, how marketable am I? You know what I mean? As a youth pastor, all things considered, all things being equal, a church is going to look at a 47, 48-year-old, and they're going to look at like a 25-year-old. And all things considered, a lot of them, I would say, are probably going to go for the younger, because he's got a lot more left in the tank, so to speak. He's got a lot more time on the clock. And I know that that's kind of an unfair, way broad brushstroke, but probably the idea that younger pastors can be more connective to today's teens. And I think that's an understandable idea, but I don't see that really holds much water. It's just, I think it's right on that line of mythical. I think. I remember several years ago, maybe probably at least 10 years ago now, our executive pastor, who's actually now our lead pastor, he walked into my office and I said something to him that must have sounded so arrogant. I said, I can be the last student ministry pastor this church hires for a really, really long time. And what I meant by that is my main desire as a pastor is to be a student of what God has called me to be. I think that the enemy of longevity is rigidity. And one of the things that I think has to be a learned characteristic for student ministry pastors, especially as you get older, is to learn to be fluid. No matter what your age is, you have to stay completely fluid when it comes to loving and serving and reaching out to and discipling your students. But when a church is looking for a youth pastor, I think that there's kind of this mindset that we need somebody who's got all the right fashion trends and they have the right car, or they talk the right language, and someone who can really be connective and super hip and just like, just almost like an older teenager type of thing, like, somebody who's tattooed, or somebody who's svelte, or somebody who's got, the right hair or the right look or whatever. And I mean, no disrespect to young svelte hipster youth pastors. I'm sure they're killing it as well. But I think probably a lot of churches they approach student ministry as who's the coolest, or who has the best image, or who students can relate to. And I got to say that it does, to what you were talking about a few minutes ago, it really does take some time to build that. I'm the uncoolest guy in the room. Any room I'm in, I'm the least cool guy there. I guarantee it. I use the term, I'm the nerd at the prom. I'm just glad to be here. So that I found really, it just takes some time to build that trust. And unfortunately, it's not an automatic thing. Like you were saying, it does take some time. And I've interacted with churches and with youth pastors that it's almost like a revolving door. And not only are you doing damage to that particular individual, that student ministry pastor, you're doing even greater damage to the students by constantly switching out the people that they're supposed to have a trust relationship with. So I don't know what lead pastors or board members are listening to this podcast, but please don't switch out your student ministry pastor for the silliest of reasons. And that's a whole other episode probably, but it seems like we're way too finicky. And as far as like just taking one youth pastor and, pulling him out after a very short term, you're not only hurting him, but you're hurting the students even more. So anyway, I hope that comes anywhere close to answering the question.
Yeah, I think it does. And I think I think the last thing you talked about is really, really important. Because a lot of times the other thing that happens, you said they aim for the hip guy or something to that nature. The other side of it is there's a lot of churches that fall into the trap of, hey, we hired this youth pastor 15 years ago, and this youth pastor was amazing. Like, we loved how they ran the program. We loved how everything they did was like, they brought in kids, they involved parents, all this stuff. And I know we've had 4 bad youth pastors since then, but we're still looking for the carbon copy of this guy. And like, you can't run a ministry like that either, because the thing is everybody brings something different to the table. And that was kind of the whole, or like, origin story of this podcast, is it was like, look, everybody has a voice. Everybody has something to contribute to the conversation that we can learn from. And while there might be some a little less experienced than others, it doesn't mean that they're bad at it. It doesn't mean that they do it wrong, because there's really not a correct way to do youth ministry. We all do it differently. But at the end of the day, there are some common things that we should all share in our approach to how we get things done. And so with that, like, having the churches that I guess already have preset expectations for what their youth pastor is going to be like, and they try to hire to fit somebody's shoes instead of give them the opportunity to run their program. It's super, super toxic, but a lot of churches do that as well. I mean, I've talked to many churches, and I was at one where it's just, they repeatedly try to find some qualities of a youth pastor that they liked. And if they don't fit that mold, then it's like, oh, like a year and a half, 2 years, sorry, you're done. But you haven't even given them a chance to really hit the ground running. Because the first 2 years, like, you are legitimately just trying to get your like feet wet. You're trying to introduce yourself to the students, the parents, trying to get yourself into the school, all the groundwork that comes into a successful ministry down the road. And then, like you said, you don't really ever hit the, I guess, growth that we all desire to see until you're down the road into at least year 3. Sometimes it's longer than that. And so I think that's a really big deal. But I do think that a lot of churches see that hip, or like see the younger guy as the opportunity. And a lot of churches are really okay with like having a senior pastor for 20, 30, 40 years. And they're like, oh, I mean, you've been here for like, what, 2.5 years? Like, and then they'll throw out some wild expectation that they had. Oh, you know, when we hired you, like, we had 5 students. We were expecting it to be 70 by now. I mean, like, something to that nature, which you talked about earlier, the unreal comparisons and measuring sticks that we use. It's unhealthy, it's toxic, and it's really, really dangerous. And so allowing yourself to stay in those churches. I am in a church where the guy that was here before me, he was here for 16 years. And so while that made some challenges for me, and I had to break some of the stereotypical molds of like, well, he did it that way forever. It's like, that's great. I'm not him. I came into this job also with a sense of security, for the sake of they're okay with having a youth pastor for a really long time. They didn't fire him. He stepped out. And so with that, it's very comforting. And ultimately if we allow ourselves to be, I guess, the people that like shift the mindset of the churches to where like, it's okay to keep youth pastors longer, ultimately we're going to see better youth ministries across the board.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think student pastors who are looking for a church would really do themselves a favor by doing some research as to the history of student ministry in that particular church before you jump in. And you can easily spot trouble. I guess it's okay to use that, troubled churches or troubled hiring and firing processes. So, but yeah, I completely agree. I think that we have something to do about it as well. And I think having an attitude of I'm going to pastor that congregation. And there have been times throughout my 16 years here, 17 years here, that every once in a while someone would say, Jerry, would you ever like to have your own church? And I understand the question, and I can respect it, I can appreciate it, but there was this light bulb moment that I had a long time ago that said, I do have a church. I have a congregation. I have a congregation of middle school and high school students, and God has called me to shepherd that congregation. And I think churches sometimes, especially the board or the hiring team or whomever, they might be looking more for like kind of a cruise director or an activity coordinator, or to fill the calendar with stuff for kids to do, rather than who can pastor these young people, because the need of a 12-year-old is vastly different than a need from a 45-year-old. And so you need a pastor who's kind of specialized in that area of pastoring a middle school and high school students. So that's my mindset. Like, I feel like I do have a church. I don't have my own building. Thank God. I'm actually, as student ministry pastors, we're in the best possible situation. We're guarded from a lot of the politics and, the muck of the senior pastorate, but yet we still get to have a congregation of our own. And it doesn't matter if that congregation is 3 kids or 300 kids. Like, we get to be a pastor to those kids. And so taking that mindset of being a pastor, but then also being willing to flex and to morph and to change with the needs of each generation and each year goes by. I think we obviously have to hold on tight to the message, but we have to barely hang on to the method of how we do it. I can tell you, I am not doing student ministry the way that it was being done 10 years ago or even 15 years ago, definitely, from when I started, because I have had to grow with the culture and the felt needs of the students and the families that I'm ministering to.
No, I totally agree. And when you were talking about that, it kind of made me think of something. Like, you never hear junior high teachers getting asked, aren't you a little old for this? Like, you have the 50, 60-year-old junior high teachers at your school.
Yeah.
Yet they never are ones that have that conversation of when are you going to get your own school? Like, it just doesn't make sense. But that just kind of whole played out in my head when you were talking. But it's such a double standard. Like, there's no other profession that works with junior high students and high school students that they're like, aren't you a little old for this? And so I thought the cruise director thing was great. I think a lot of church members unintentionally find their ultimate goal with youth is just to have them in the building.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily that they're at fault for that. I think it's great. Yeah. But more than likely that's their experience from when they were in youth.
Yeah.
And so you have that and we had a youth pastor and he was awesome and he did all these games. And, I came to know Jesus a long time after that, but I remember being in the church and I remember my fond memories and stuff like that. And it's that's great. But what if we could teach the high school kids about the Jesus that you learned about in your 30s when they were in their teens?
Yeah.
And so I think it's Well-Intentioned Dragons. That's actually the name of a book. I'm gonna have to put it in the show notes and figure out who wrote it. But it talks about all the people in church that have this grand idea of something, but in all reality, it's more harmful than it is helpful. But I think it's very much a thing.
Yeah.
But I thought, the cruise director thing was a very, very good reference.
Mm-hmm.
And so for the student pastors that feel like they're getting, I guess, for lack of a better word, too old for student ministry anymore, what would your advice be for them? Maybe they're on the edge of burnout and that's causing this man, I'm too old for this. I don't think I can do this anymore. What would your advice be for them as far as maybe just continuing to press on and then maybe some personal care?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll start off just by saying the end of this past school year, so not even 5 months ago, I sat down with our executive pastor, and I just told him I am headed toward burnout. By the end of this summer, I can forecast that I'm going to be spent. I'm going to have nothing left. And there's a lot of kind of backstory there that's kind of not important in this moment. But I just want to say, if you feel like you're worn out, or you feel like you're too old, or you're discouraged for whatever reason, I'm with you. And if I can be of any kind of encouragement, I want to share with you just what has happened in my life since. I think the first thing that you need to do, and this is what I did, is to just step back from ministry. And I don't mean it has to be like a full-on sabbatical. It could be a 24-hour period, whatever that fits your context. And I know, just depending on where you are, kind of dictates what's possible. But I think you have to just be able to just step back. The analogy that I use for whomever is thinking about, going into ministry, or when I talk to other people in full-time ministry, I use the analogy of an assembly line. Can you just imagine yourself just working in a factory on an assembly line, and that same item, that same product just keeps coming, and you've got your little station, and you've got to put this plate on, you got to tighten that bolt, and you've got to attach that, and you got to make sure it's ready before it moves on down the assembly line. That assembly line is never going to turn off. Like, it's never going to stop. Ministry is never going to stop. The needs of people are never going to end. So it's on me as a pastor to have the discipline to be able to just take a step back and realize that assembly line is just going to keep going. People's needs are still going to be there. But at least for a season, maybe even just a short season, I need to step back and catch my breath and get a different, better perspective of what's going on. So I just got super critical, I think in a good way, toward what we had been doing. I don't think that there's a formula outside of Scripture, at least, that tells us how to do ministry in our unique context. The church that I'm at is probably very different than the church that you're at, and it's very different than the church that our listeners are at. So every ministry context is different. So I do not believe in formulaic type of student ministry. I think we easily fall into that rut. I think it's super easy to look at, to steal things like, hey, that program or that attempt over there is working, so I'm just going to carbon copy it and bring it over here and expect that to work. I really don't believe that is the best way to approach ministry. So I started to get critical and ask, what are we doing and why are we doing it? And you have to sharpen the blade and get ready to slaughter some sacred cows, because you're going to have to look at like I'm looking very critically at our Sunday student gathering. And it goes down to why are we even doing this? What is the purpose of us doing this? Now, I know in my heart, and I definitely understand it from a biblical standpoint, why we're doing it, but why are we doing it the way that we're doing it? And so I think step one, you have to step back from your ministry context and everything that you're doing. And that may, you might be able to get yourself, maybe, take some vacation time if you need to, or at the very least, just take a Saturday or a day where you don't have anything else planned. You can get out of town, you can kind of clear your head. So in some ways, step back from ministry. That's step number one. And then number two, look critically at what you're doing and see how much you can slice off. I think we fall into this mindset as student ministry pastors: the more we're doing, the better we're doing, or the more activities or things we have on the calendar, the better people are going to like us, or the more kids are going to have fun, or the better disciples we're going to make. In my most recent meeting with our group of volunteer leaders and our student leaders, we were all together in one room. And the number one thing I came out of that meeting with as the youth pastor was them saying, we're doing too much. We have too many activities. Why don't we scale back? We call them blitzes here. And a blitz is just a monthly event where our kids can invite an unconnected friend. And there's no worship time, there's no prayer circle, there's no message. It's just kind of like, come and have a good time with us. And they get introduced to our student ministry. And I came out of that meeting with my leaders saying, why don't we go to quarterly blitz event? So I think sometimes student pastors can be their own worst enemy when it comes to just how we allocate our time and how we plan things and all that. So step back, look at what you're doing, and then just start slicing and dicing. If something doesn't have a specific purpose, and this is a whole other conversation, you have to understand why you're doing things you're doing in the first place. Like, we have purpose words that we use. If it doesn't accomplish one of our purposes, then why are we doing it? And what's stopping us from just not doing it? Sometimes in my mind, something is super important when in the minds of parents and students, they don't even know it exists. And so I've got to understand the chasm between those two spaces and be willing to swallow my pride and say, maybe this is just important because I said it's important. Or maybe I think this thing is effective because I really like doing it. When in actuality, this is not even an effective thing that I'm doing. And so you got to be brutally honest, and you have to say, what can I stop doing? And then I alluded to something earlier. What am I doing that someone else could be doing? Because you're going to gain some margin back in your schedule, and you're also going to gain some confidence and some fuel by watching other people do the things that you were kind of greedily holding on to yourself. So are you investing in other leaders? And this is not a church size issue. If you are a lone ranger, that's what my dad was, and he was my pastor growing up. He was a lone ranger. So I know that life really well. If you're a lone ranger in ministry, there's at least one other human being in your context of ministry that you can sit down with and at least introduce the idea of, hey, I've got this, this task, and it'll probably take you 2 hours a week. And would you be open to praying about it? And then from there, just let that snowball roll down the hill. Are you investing in other leaders? Are you regularly doing what fuels you? This is going to make me sound even older than I am, but my wife and I, we love going to vintage antique places. We're not really looking for anything. We're just wandering around, just looking at old stuff. And that sounds like a really old person thing to do. And so I guess it fits. 48 years old, who knows? But are you doing the things that fuel you? It could be skateboarding. It could be writing, it could be fishing. Are you doing the things that are fueling you? And do you have a clear and strong communication with your lead pastor, or is there somebody on staff that you report to? We have to have a release valve. You have to have an outlet where you can just download. If you've got crud going on, you need somebody that you can download to. I have someone like that for me on staff. His name is Ron. And I also have one of the parent, actually he's a parent of students who are now adults, but I'll just regularly go out to lunch at least once a month, and we'll just have lunch. And I know that this guy is safe, and I know that he's for me, and I know that he supports me, and I know that he prays for me. And I know that anything I share with him, it's going to stop right there. And he's just going to, he's a good sounding board. Do you have somebody that you can just have strong, clear, honest communication with? And just lastly, I guess, just to remind everyone, there's no expiration date in student ministry. I think there are indicators that can kind of warn us that we're in a place of unhealth. But, I go to youth pastor conferences, and there's some 80-year-old youth pastor there, and he's still killing it. He's still connecting with students. He's still crushing it, still making young disciples of this next generation. So don't ever think, like I've been tempted to think, don't ever think, probably 48 is about quitting time. Because I'll go back to the way I started this conversation. God, if you'll let me do this for life in some form or fashion, that I get to invest in the lives of this young generation, and I get to introduce them to this wild-eyed Jesus that I've been walking with for some 30 years. That's what I'm about, and that's what I'm here for. So I hope that is some kind of an encouragement, and somebody who might be feeling old or burned out or worn out can take some kind of nugget from that and be encouraged, because I know exactly where you are and how you feel. And God's not done with you yet. He's not done with using you in young people's lives.
Yeah, that's awesome. I would totally agree with everything. And I'd also say, to the nature of burnout comes multiple times in your lifespan as a youth pastor. I am 31. I have done half of the youth ministry career, or less than half of the youth ministry career, as Jerry. And I'm also, guys, this last year and a half, 2 years has been spiritually just draining for everybody.
Totally.
So if you feel like you are in this season of burnout, you and every other youth pastor that I've ever talked to is.
Right.
But it's because of the emotional and spiritual toll that this last 2 years has taken. And so you are not alone if you are feeling that. And I totally encourage you to do everything that Jerry said. And I'm going to add a few other things to it. First and foremost, we did a episode earlier on in our podcast. I think it's like episode 4 or 5. And I could be completely wrong, but I'll link it in the show notes for this podcast. Stephen Gehring was one of my early guests on the show, and we did a episode on pastoral care, and we talked about giving that care to students, but we spent a long time talking about giving that care to ourselves as well. And so I would encourage you to go listen to that. And I'm going to mention something now that I brought up in that episode. I have 2 other recommendations that I'd recommend for if you're experiencing or thinking about quitting. If you're not in a community of youth pastors that you speak to regularly, find one. It can be in person to where you meet with other youth pastors in your town. So you can talk about the exhausting toll of youth ministry sometimes, but you have to have people that are able to understand what you're talking about. You can't just go out with like friends of yours that have different occupations and go like lay your heart out of all the stuff you've been dealing with as a student pastor. They're not going to understand. So you need to have that bouncing board of having other youth pastors that can like side and sit by you and be like, yeah, I totally get that. I totally understand where you're coming from. And they might even have advice to throw your way. I did that at my last church. I realized that I was that lone gun. We had just moved into a town. I was 5 hours away from my family, 6 hours away from my wife's family. We just had our first kid. And I got on one of the Facebook groups at the time that was for youth pastors. And I was just like, hey, does anybody want to do like a Google Hangout where we can just like sit and talk about youth ministry over the internet? And that Google Hangout turned into something that we did for like 3 or 4 years, every single Thursday. And then to this day, most of the guys that came to that hangout, we still have a Facebook message that we talk every single day about ministry, about life. A couple of them have even moved out of youth ministry into other professions, and they're still in that conversation. But it's just building that community of people that you have, that you trust, that you can interact with on a regular basis. Most of that group, I still have never met face-to-face. It is a goal of all of ours that one day we're eventually just going to make this trip and we're going to meet somewhere centrally located because they're all over the US. But we're going to like meet one day and like all have just like a weekend together. But like I said, a lot of them I've never met face to face, and I'm totally okay with that. But I know without a shadow of a doubt that I can trust them because like they've been some of my best friends for the past 7-8 years. The second thing that I would do, and this is what I recommended on that podcast episode that I'm going to link in the description, is find a hobby that you can do start to finish. Because like you said, ministry is an assembly line. We're so used to putting on the same pieces over and over and over and over. And a lot of times we never get to see that finished product. So one of the deepest desires that I've found in youth ministry is our desire to see a completed project. So with that, find something that you can do with your hands that you can see from start to finish and complete tasks. That can be graphic design, that can be writing like blog posts for other websites, that can be woodworking. I know a lot of people that do woodworking. I know a lot of people that do like, I guess it's called thrifting, where they go and like find stuff on like at Goodwill and stuff like that and resell it on eBay. Anything that you can see from start to finish that allows you to have that feeling of completion. Because when you go through life and you feel like you don't complete anything, man, there is nothing more draining because you feel like a failure. You feel like nothing you do ever actually happens and ever actually works. And when in reality, it's just you are working in that assembly line on this piece over and over and over and over. And so you need to have that sense of completion somewhere else. I do graphic design, I do websites, I do woodworking on occasion, anything to get my hands dirty and have an opportunity to have that sense of completion. And guys, it can be as easy as mowing a yard. Like if you've ever mowed a yard before that was like tacky and real high and like where you like it's knee high and like
right.
You finish it and like edge it and everything like that. And like you just sit back for a second and you're like, man, that looks great. That's that sense of completion that you're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
So I would super, super encourage you to find something that you can do to bring that sense of completion to the table, because it's going to help your mood. It's going to help in that season of burnout. And then ultimately it's going to keep you and prevent you from burning out in the future. Excuse me. So outside of everything else, and we've had a good conversation so far, with a lot of great stuff. But outside of this conversation, for a youth pastor that is struggling in this topic, conversation, everything like that, where else can they go to help? Do you have any resources that have been like beneficial for you? Maybe a book or maybe a podcast that you listen to?
Yeah.
Any resources that you can share?
Yeah, I've listened to. I'm a big fan of DYM, Download Youth Ministry, and if you're in student ministry, you really ought to be on that Facebook page. Where it's, I don't know. I think last time I heard it was like 15,000 youth pastors in this Facebook group, and you can just go to the top of it and just do a search, and there are probably multiple conversations about any given topic that have already happened. But you can go at any time and just ask a question. You can vent about something. There's all different kinds of youth pastors and all different kinds of denominations and everything. But it's just a really sweet community of people who know exactly where you are and what you're dealing with and what you're going through. And you can bounce ideas off of. You can steal other ideas. And so, yeah, that's definitely one that I would look at. And I will, let me see I'm reading a book by John Acuff right now called Soundtracks. And I'm a big John Acuff fan. So I would really recommend it. It's not student ministry focused per se, but man, there is a lot in there that I'm like underlining and asterisks and writing in the margins. And like, that's me totally. Or I'm doing that or some kind of unhealthy habit, but Soundtracks is a fantastic book that I'm reading right now. So I can definitely recommend that. The Carrie Newhoff Leadership Podcast is also another fantastic, again, it's not specific to student ministry, but just leadership principles, really good stuff. So yeah, I've really grown in my respect for Carrie Newhoff and what he's doing. Let's see. Those are a few that just are right off the top of my head as far as resources, places that I find ideas or encouragement. I want to echo, Brent, what you were just saying about just having a local group of other youth leaders that you can call on and lean on and grab coffee with. I think that's to me, that's probably just one of the best resources that you can find, is just some face-to-face interaction with somebody.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And the thing is when you know that they are dealing with the same things you're dealing with, mm-hmm. you're open a lot more in your conversations.
Yeah.
When you're talking to people,
spirit.
Yeah, when you're talking to people that don't understand, you're really hesitant to kind of like unload. Mm-hmm. Because let's be honest, youth pastor is not like the best occupation to make friends. Because a lot of times we fall under the pastor stereotype where like they have to be perfect around us and stuff like that. Yeah. And so like when we start like actually having enough of a conversation and a relationship with the people around us that we're like, I do have a chance to vent, but like, I don't want to scare them off either. Like I want, there's like this happy medium that we try, or a line that we try and walk. And you don't have to do that with other youth pastors. They know where you are. They know what you've been through. And more than likely, they're dealing with the same thing at the same time. Because a lot of the stuff that we deal with right now is cultural. And it's taxing. It's exhausting. And you need someone to walk through this with. And that needs to be something that you really, really prioritize. So
true.
Man, other than that, absolute great content for this conversation. We're super excited that we were able to get you on, Jerry. How can people connect with you on social media? Do you have a shameless plug for anything else that you have your hands in?
Totally.
Anything for the listeners of this to go follow you in?
Yeah, I came up with this really encoded screen name, username. Jerry Varner is where you just look pretty much almost anywhere. Well, not anywhere, but let's see, Twitter at Jerry Varner, JerryVarner. Same thing on Instagram, Jerry Varner. I have a blog and I love writing. It's just like you were saying, it's one of the things that I can see from beginning to end. I love to write. That's just something that fuels me. And I hope that comes through in what you read there. But my website is jerrythinks.com. That's my blog. And I will just say from the very beginning, it's not like specifically talking about student ministry. I really just, the things that I experience just on the day-to-day basis, God speaks to me through, and then I'll translate that into something that is hopefully encouraging to the reader. So if you want to look, jerrythinks.com, I would love for anybody, if that's any kind of encouragement to anybody, that would be great. But really, I'm on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all of those. Just search Jerry Varner. And then jerrythinks.com.
Yeah. And so I also kind of have to make you do one more thing, just because it is possibly the coolest thing I've ever heard of. Tell them about the podcast that you do with your students.
Oh, I'm so glad you said that. I totally forgot. Thank you. We do, it's called the 2x4 Student Podcast. You can find it on Spotify or iTunes podcast, wherever really you look for a podcast. Just 2x4 Student Podcast. And that is, we called it that because it's 2 students, 5 students, and 4 students. So 2x4 Student Podcast. I looked, and maybe I got a blind spot, but I looked for students doing podcasts, like students talking about what's important to students. I found a lot of student ministry podcasts and awesome ones like this one, but I didn't see a lot of students behind the microphone just talking with each other. So I kind of just facilitate and just kind of keep the conversation going. But we actually just started our 3rd season, and we record once a week. And usually every Wednesday, if I do my job, every Wednesday a new episode comes out. And and I literally just kind of turn the conversation over to them, and they talk about whatever it is that's on their heart or their mind. And I'll warn you, sometimes it's super in the shallow end and kind of silly, but we also actually really have some great conversations, spiritual conversations about how does today's American teenager love Jesus and still survive high school with their spirit intact. So a lot of really great topics and conversations come up. It's super organic, super conversational. But yeah, if you'd be willing to check that out, it's just a really fun kind of project that we do. But 2x4 Student Podcast, we just started an Instagram account because what we want to do is we want to go Instagram live when we're recording, and that's usually on Sunday mornings at 10, which I know probably for your crowd is a terrible time to check in. But 2x4_podcast is our Instagram account for the 2x4 podcast. But yeah, thanks for mentioning that. I totally blanked on our.
No, you're totally good. I wanted to make sure that got on there because that is one of the coolest things I think I've ever heard of a youth pastor doing. Is taking a love for like podcasts and stuff like that and literally incorporating it into what you do in ministry. Super, super, super cool. And it is on my podcast list of what I listen to. Awesome. And some seriously great conversations. Like you said, there's 3 seasons. And so like tons of episodes for you to go listen to. And it might even be something that like you use as an opportunity to spark conversations in your own student ministry.
Yeah.
Because I mean, if students hear students talking about events and talking about things that are going on, it might be a great conversation starter.
Yeah.
But so other than that, Jerry, this has been amazing. You are amazing. Thank you, sir, for your longevity in youth ministry. Thank you for being such a bright light, especially for so long. And we do definitely appreciate your wisdom. And like I said, we definitely need to have the rest of the Jerry Varner words of wisdom on the blog sometime.
Yeah, I would love that.
So we'll get that rolling and we'll get some of those out over the next couple weeks. But other than that, guys, hope you enjoyed this podcast episode. Please leave a rating, leave a comment. Tell us what you think about the show. If there's any conversations that we haven't done that you'd really like to hear, or if you want to be a guest on the show, we'd love to have you. We'd love to get you in on the conversation. Just reach out. You can email us podcast@studentministryconversations.org, or you can message us on any of our social media @TalkStudentMen. We'd love to have you. But until next time, we are going to sign off. Love you guys. Y'all have a great week, and we will see y'all later.
Hey, well, Brent, that was great. And Jerry, thank you for joining us. And thank you for listening, for giving your time to listen to this podcast. And we hope that maybe you were encouraged and inspired by this week's episode, and that you found some tool or something that you can use as you continue to pour into the lives of your students.
Yeah, if you enjoyed this episode and found it helpful, we would ask that you leave a comment and a rating on whatever platform you're listening to us on. We would appreciate that so much. Also, maybe you know someone who would benefit from this conversation. Take a moment, share this with them on social media, tag them and tag us @TalkStudentMen on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Also, we have some new things to mention. That now we have a merchandise store where you can support the podcast and get some t-shirts. You can check that out at studentministryconversations.org under the shop tab. And then also you can support our podcast because we are listener supported. We have great ambitions for this podcast, to make it better audio quality, to have transcripts available for each episode on our website that you can look and read through, and all of that costs money, and we would love to get that out there for you. So if you enjoy this podcast and you would not mind giving financially to support us, we would appreciate it. You can also find a link to that on our website as well.
Yeah, definitely. Hey, listen, we have some great episodes coming up and some great interviews scheduled. And several of y'all have already reached out and said you want to be on a podcast, and you have made suggestions. And so we are putting those together and making those recordings. And we are looking forward so much to the conversations we have in the coming weeks. And we also want to remind you, go back and look at all the other podcasts. We were talking today, we have 26 episodes up. We've done this for half of a year. And so we hope that you will go back and re-listen to previous ones. Go back and find your favorites. Let us know what your favorites are as you continue to listen to the Student Ministry Conversations podcast.
Just a reminder, be sure to go to studentministryconversations.org for show notes and links from this episode. Just search for this week's episode number in the search bar. We also have other helpful articles and posts as well. Again, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week.